First, I'd like to just formally thank the sponsors of today's Common Hour presentation, the Departments of Biology, Theater, Dance, and Film, Earth and Environment, and the Biological Foundations of Behavior, as well as the Academic Innovation Fund from the Provost's Office. I'd also like to alert you to 2 additional events that you can interact with today's speaker at 4:30 today. He'll be giving a craft talk about nature documentary filmmaking in Brooks' Great Room. That's at 4:30. And then tomorrow at noon, as part of Earth and Environment's Light Lunch, he'll be talking about the current conservation status of the sage-grouse, and that's in Hackman 119. So it's my honor today to introduce Marc Dantzker. Marc's journey as a field biologist and filmmaker have deeply informed his recent film, Sagebrush Sea, which we'll hear about today. And I think that his work reveals the synergy in the keen eye of a naturalist and in the keen eye of an artist. Marc received a bachelor's degree at the University of Texas, a master's from Duke, although we won't hold that against him, and a PhD at the University of California at San Diego, where he worked with the famous animal communicationist Jack Bradbury. Right as Marc was finishing his time in San Diego, Jack was hired to take over a group at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and brought Marc with him, where Marc developed the video animal behavior arm of the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. He worked there for more than 10 years, producing films and online multimedia in support of science education and wildlife conservation, including documenting the effects of the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and the effects on wildlife of the US-Mexico border wall. He's since left the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology and has set out on his own to form his own production company called Range-Wide Productions. It's also a personal honor for me to introduce Marc because he's a close personal friend, and I've always been inspired by his boundless energy, his sharp intellect and biting wit, and his passion for bearing visual witness to endangered ecosystems, including one, the Sagebrush Sea, literally today still under siege in the state of Oregon. Please join me in welcoming Marc Dantzker.
Hi, wow. I'm having pizza at every event I do because obviously that helps draw people in. This is really exciting. I'm really happy to be here at the Common Hour, both because the Common Hour itself is a really cool concept and also because it means I didn't end up in a ditch last night driving down from DC. So I'm very happy to be here safely and presenting to you guys today. I'm used to actually screening the film and then talking about it, so let me get a couple of credits out of the way because usually I come up after a roll of credits. I will say it's my film because I'm the co-director, co-writer, producer, but the cast of people who worked on this, about 7 cinematographers and just a ton of people in post-production, et cetera. It's a very long credit reel, so this is not me as a one-person shop. And if I say we, it's the production team and or the Lab of Ornithology, where I only left the lab about a month ago, so I may still speak as if I am there. All of the photos today are from one of our cinematographers, Garrett Vinn, who is a better photographer than me, so I use his pictures. Okay, enough caveats. So, we aren't probably going to make the list of top 10 most influential environmental films ever, but we do feel like we work to make a film that would make a difference for a specific ecosystem. At least that's what we were trying to do. So I hope that the title here is a little, you understand, is a little aspirational. We wanted to make a film about a place that we could have some impact on the siege or the changes that are happening in this spot. And so think of this as more of a self-criticism, hopefully, than hopefully too much of an ego piece. We're going to look at what the Sagebrush Sea is, why it needs conserving, why we thought a film would help with that, besides the fact that we are filmmakers, whether or not we've had any impact with the film and the situation, and what are we doing next. And so thankfully, this is a university setting, so you all did your homework and watched the film last night. Okay, so I'm going to play a trailer for you because you'll go home and watch it tonight, but I'll play a trailer, and I'm going to have a chance to play a few a few sections of the film for you during the thing, but I would say it's kind of a, well, it's a labor of love. So I'll play you just the first, this is literally the trailer that aired in advance of the film, so it ends with a promo. And it starts quietly.
On an icy plateau, a lone performer takes the stage. In a deep freeze with 40-mile-an-hour winds, he begins his ancient display. His plumage is designed to dazzle. Key to his success is to stand out in this vast expanse. His home is often called the Big Empty. But that couldn't be farther from the truth. Those who look closely will discover a landscape full of life. On this stage, the struggle for survival has played out for millions of years. But change is on the horizon, splintering what remains of the wilderness, forcing those who call this home to face an uncertain future.
So the film that we made aired on PBS as part of the series Nature. We made the film first, and Nature agreed to pick it up, partly because it was incredibly topical. The sage-grouse, which is figured prominently in the film, was up for a potential listing under the Endangered Species Act in September of this last year, and we knew that, and we wanted to play a role, not necessarily in the decision-making process, but actually in the perception of what was at stake. Because there were a lot of players talking about the biology and talking about the land and talking about policy. But we really felt wasn't happening was an understanding of the place in the organism. So we wanted to contribute before then. We got the film out in May, and it aired again only a week before the listing decision was announced. And I'll leave some suspense for what that is if you aren't following yet. So the Sagebrush Sea, what is the Sagebrush Sea? You saw a little bit of it there. It's a huge area. It's 250,000 square miles. The lighter color, which I don't know if you can make out here, is the historic range of the Sagebrush Sea. But the green is where it's still Sagebrush Sea. It's 250,000 square miles. That's a lot of area. And compared to some other ecosystems, that really just doesn't look that bad. I mean, in terms of decline, right? The tallgrass prairie is 1 or 2 or 3% of what it used to be. So 50% in this world of conservation is not terrible. But what's not clear from that map is what's happened to the habitat within it. And so this graphic here shows you the decline in grouse numbers that happened alongside the 50% loss in habitat. So there used to be something on the order of 5 to 15 million birds, and now we're down to 3, 4, maybe 100,000. So what this graphic tells you, if the range is decreased by half, but the numbers of birds have gone bam, is that the carrying capacity of the land is down. The quality of the land is down precipitously. And so something's happening out there. And what is it? And so actually, I think we're going to do some a biology thing tomorrow where I'll go more into these. So I'm going to stick more to the film here, but I wanted to just sort of run through what the reasons for the decline are. Basically, it's the same thing declines happen for most things. It's habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. In this case, it's largely the nesting habitat of these birds. The species has been hit really badly by fires. It's not the invasive species themselves, but they're grasses that are adapted to encourage fire instead of the ecosystem that's there that was adapted to resist fire. So the invasive grasses are taking over and burning large tracts of land. That's the biggest problem in some places. In some places, it's oil and gas development, which are just, when they come in, they just knock it all out and it doesn't come back. But in some places, the birds are experiencing none of that and still declining a lot. Unsustainable grazing is a huge factor across the range, and that's the one that it's actually my first East Coast talk on this subject to a public audience out west. This is the one where I duck my head when I put it up, because it's actually the one that's the most contentious. You'd think it was oil and gas, but it's not. Well, maybe you wouldn't think that given the news lately. And then we shouldn't fool ourselves that green energy is particularly good for wildlife. It's actually pretty tough on wildlife out there. The wind farms, the grouse stay low to the ground. You'd think they might like wind farms that would scare away the eagles or chop them up, but actually they're terrified of tall structures, and so they go nowhere near any wind farms. And the infrastructure around it increases, the whole overall human footprint. The transmission lines are absolutely terrible for the birds as well. So green energy has a pretty strong footprint on these animals. Sprawl, even some of these are the fastest growing areas in the US, even though we call it the big empty because it seems like almost nobody lives there, it actually is spreading rapidly, and it spreads along the quality habitat. People want to be where the water is in this desert are the areas that the birds need at certain times of year, so it has a dramatic impact on the species. And it's not just the sprawl, it's the ranchettes, the vacation homes that are a few acres, or the people who are moving out into it, and it looks nice and pristine, but that's enough for the birds to avoid the area. So I mentioned that the infrastructure adds to the footprint. It's actually one of the worst things that we do is we have new places for predators to perch and new places for extra food for them to eat. So eagles and ravens have a greater penetration. Ravens get the really, really bad reputation. They're a natural predator out there, but they are at a higher density than they should be because they are commensal with humans. That means we make there be more of them than there should be. So they get shot. In fact, the ravens in the film that we did profile after I filmed them, the next day Fish and Wildlife came and shot the nest with a shotgun to decrease the raven populations. It was a natural nest in a place where there'd probably been a raven's nest for thousands of years. So it was heartbreaking that we scapegoat them as individuals, but on a population level, it's true. So those are mostly all things that happen to the nests or in the nestlings. There are sources of adult mortality. Adults fly into ranch fences, a lot of barbed wire fences. You'll see grouse feathers on, and it usually means something was decapitated and then the carcass was dragged away that night. Roads are, there's a few sage-grouse crossing road signs out there to warn you, but the chicks are little. It's like having chickens all over the place. When they're crossing, they barely register a speed bump. Hunting is a direct source of mortality, but it isn't a major one now. People still hunt this bird, hunting in the past has been maybe to detriment, but it's heavily regulated now. Not that many birds are taken, and nobody sees that as a major factor, although there are political reasons for that as well. And then we thought, and this comes around to sort of why we made the film, that it simply was also just something people didn't care about, and that doesn't help. It was sort of not just not known about, but disregarded. Here's a quote from the New York Times back when we were working on the film. The article was called "Frack Quietly, Please, Sage-Grouse is Nesting." "The spotted owl never had it this good, but like that bird, which became a bitter symbol of the conflict between environmental and economic development a generation ago, the greater sage-grouse, a chicken-like bird known for its flamboyant courtship strut, has seen its numbers plunge far and fast." So the New York Times and many others have called it the spotted owl of our age. And it's a lot bigger, a lot more money and a lot more jobs and a lot more area at stake in this last set of decisions. And people don't like that when a bird stands in between progress and themselves. The Wall Street Journal loves this bird. They said, the two species with the greatest impact on private development are range birds, the Greater Sage-grouse and the lesser prairie chicken, we won't talk about today, but another grouse, both about the size of a barnyard chicken, leading to, quote, one of the largest federal land grabs in modern times. Now, I don't know how many of you have been paying a lot of attention out there, but federal land grab is a big word right now. So we used to, out west, everybody talks about the oil and gas component of that because oil and gas wants to be able to lease lands and use them, and they have fights about who, where, and who gets to regulate. But that compares nothing right now, right, to the hoodlums, terrorists, whatever you want to call them. And I'm delighted that this is the image I get to show because I'm absolutely ecstatic. These guys have been picked up, taken in, and hopefully treated the way they should be. So this, if you haven't been following, these are the Bundy occupiers, terrorists in Oregon, and they're there. It's not just about sage-grouse, but it is about the ethic of who runs the public lands in the United States and why the BLM runs the public lands in the United States. So we the people, not the BLM. There's this false sense that there's a federal land grab when the federal government actually owns the land, and they own it for good historical reasons, that it's illegal how they manage it, but it's all nicely legal. I think this one's hard to see back there, but the federal government owns a massive amount of Western land. This is a Western issue, and there's a great historical reason for that, but we won't go into here. There's a good New York Times article called Why the Government Owns So Much Land in the West, and it's interesting. This is a map from that, so BLM and Forest Service, et cetera. The grouse habitat is about 60% on BLM land. The private lands are really, really important because they're where the wet areas tend to be, but there's a lot of public land at stake here and public land policy. As I mentioned, there's plenty of legal backing for the BLM's management and what they do. Going back to the Taylor Grazing Act, which formed the predecessor of the BLM, NEPA, Endangered Species Act, et cetera, the legal backing for the way we manage this has been contested in the courts, and it lasts. It's not there's no foundation for the complaints about federal land grabs. We simply aren't federally land grabbing. So we knew that this was actually a surprisingly contentious issue when we jumped into it. Why this bird? Why this issue? Partly because I happen to love this bird. I did my thesis on it. And when I did, I studied the acoustics of its display, which are spectacular. It's an incredible evolutionary story. But I wasn't really tuned in to the conservation components of its troubles at the time. And only after joining the Cornell lab, where I really learned to get out of the esoteric and into the reality of what was happening in the world, did I really wake up to what was happening with the bird that I loved so much. So we convinced some people to let us make a movie, and we made the movie. It's a DVD. I wouldn't suggest buying the DVD. It's actually online free for like the next 7 years on PBS. It's lower resolution on the DVD, but it's online for free. It's on the app, the PBS app, on your Apple TV or Roku or your phone, your iPad. You can watch it for free and in HD, and it's we're really proud that PBS put it out. It put a stamp of authenticity and objectivity on it that we really appreciated. We put a lot of effort into not making an advocacy film that would be unpalatable, and we'll talk about that decision in a minute. But I did want to not just yammer on, I want to show you a little more of the film. I'm just picking out natural history moments now because the issue pieces are more subtle, and so I want to sort of avoid them. I'm going to show you just a little bit more about why I love this bird.
The melt reveals a sea of sage. Sage is the anchor of the high desert. Without it, the land would be a dust bowl. These twisted shrubs can live 140 years. Extending for hundreds of miles in every direction, they're the foundation of this wilderness. The wildlife here has evolved with the sage for over 2 million years. On the flats below lies the home of the grouse. They've spent the last 8 months hiding. But in early spring, their genetic imperative draws them to these open stages. Years of thaw and evaporation have left patches of salty sediment. The grouse use these clearings as leks, gathering sites for their mating ritual. As other males approach, the contest begins. They only have a few weeks before the females arrive to establish their dominance and a territory. Pairs square off, facing just past each other. And then fights are ferocious and frequent. Males battle dozens of times a day. Serious injuries are rare. Mostly, it's a battle to exhaustion. The chance to mate only comes once a year, and for grouse, years are limited. Most males won't live more than 4 years. They might well only get 2 chances to breed, if they survive.
So that's part of why I love this bird, is it's just a spectacular and amazing creature, and we wanted to try and imbue it with a sense of importance and sort of a Western fortitude, because all too often, and maybe not so surprisingly so, the bird isn't taken as seriously. This is from the New York Times, so I'm allowed to put it up. But it's a funny-looking bird, and we call it one of the birds of paradise of the United States. They're incredibly specialized for display, but they are a fancy chicken in the end, and people treat them that way. And so I actually grabbed this. Not to over-highlight one random commenter online, but from one of the Bundy's websites, this rewrite of Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. If I had known I was going to do this, I would have brought my guitar. But I'm going to highlight this sort of, don't need no tree huggers, don't need no sage-grouse, don't need no bureaucrats watching over me. Just want to be left alone, run my business, and don't pay attention to them subsidies. So people out there, the Bundys included, really don't like sage-grouse. They really don't like environmentalists. They really don't like, and it's true. I mean, the characterization is largely true, having traveled around the West. Now, I've met a lot of progressive ranchers and a lot of great people out there, but the general, it is a very divisive issue. So. We had been approached originally about making a film by somebody from Audubon who really wanted us to do it, and we had a lot of discussion about whether or not we would make an advocacy film or a nature film, and I'm going to distinguish between the two by saying, that advocacy films like An Inconvenient Truth, The Cove, Gasland, and Chasing Ice, these are spectacular films. I mean, really important. I mean, Inconvenient Truth, really important. The Cove might be the most important, influential film that nobody saw. It's still disturbing. I don't know if anybody wanted to watch it, but we all knew what it was about. We felt this wouldn't help the issue by going in and delving into public land issues and differences of opinion. So we took what some of us at our organization felt was the fluffier route. We made a nature film. And nature films run the gamut. They don't all even aspire to conservation, although some of them weave it into their story. Wing Migration certainly had a little bit meant to tell you that there were anthropogenic troubles along the way. But really, a nature film can be quite fluffy and not necessarily important. And we wanted to thread this sort of needle and address these things in a way that would not turn people off, so that if you were in the oil and gas business, as you watched our film, you would recognize that this was about your home. You would see that we were going to talk about oil and gas, but we weren't going to vilify you. We were only going to talk about it long enough that you might still not hit the remote button and turn it off. Same thing with ranchers, and we had ranchers come and looking for our agenda and then watch the film and say, okay, that's a pretty postcard about where I live. Okay, it is pretty beautiful. And so really we didn't want to turn off the people but we didn't avoid addressing these. And I'm not actually going to show you a clip of it because everywhere I try and yank a clip out, it feels like we went right at it. But in the context of the film, except for maybe if you have a really big subwoofer and you hear the boom in the bottom, it doesn't sound very doom and gloom. We really tried to say, look, this is a place that it's not wilderness. We live here. We have our footprint, and there are ways in which that's the cause of the problem, and be a little more objective about it. And we tried to make it go. Obviously, we're trying to address most prominently, most directly, this lack of regard. The last thing on my list here. I want to show you another scene because I think I think of it as it was a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down. We did want it to be beautiful. We wanted it to have a message. I'm concentrating these clips on the beauty, so I thought I'd show you another bit about the diversity in the sage. It's not just about the sage-grouse.
Unlike ravens and bluebirds, grouse are tied to unbroken expanses of sage. Without it, the species would cease to exist. The sagebrush sparrow would also disappear. Each year, they return here to lay their eggs. They breed nowhere else. The sage thrasher and brewer's sparrow do the same. Though their songs are beautiful, their feathers are drab to blend into this landscape. Without the sage and the nursery it provides, these species would be lost. Sagebrush is a nursery for plants as well. While it's toxic for most animals to eat, it's actually called a nurse plant because its shade and roots help other plants grow.
It's pretty to a fault. I mean, that's what we were really going for. We figured this is the sort of constituency, the general public audience that we were going for. There's a lot of awareness about sage-grouse and a lot of materials made for policymakers. The agencies are deeply engaged. This wasn't a wake up the government moment. This wasn't the time for that. We did that with BP oil spill and various other things. We engaged the government and agencies. The NGOs were already there. Audubon, very active in the space. The Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory, very active. And lots of conservation organizations, hunting and fishing organizations, really focused on saving the sagebrush via the sage-grouse. The community the NGO community largely was very divided over what the right thing to do was in terms of the listing decision. But we really wanted to have this sort of overall, regardless of what the decision was, we wanted people who would watch the film to understand that whatever it was important. And so we got, between the two viewings, we got a few million, 2.5 million people or something to watch it on PBS, or households, I should say. So that's more than I'd ever learned about the sagebrush before, but it's still a drop in the bucket. We had the NGOs out west. We've held, I think I've had about 15 screenings and discussion sections, and they've had tens more across the West and continue to have them. They use the film as the basis to have a civil discussion, and we've had some really interesting discussions with people who don't get along. After watching the film, it's kind of hard to get up in each other's grill. It's a nice film. So we knew that we had to go beyond the film, though, so we did do a little work in the DC world. And I got a chance, I actually met the Secretary of the Interior, and that generated an invitation to present the film at the White House. Now, it was Obama's birthday, so the gentleman I'm walking here with is Tim Mayle. He runs the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act for the president. That is the White House and the West Wing there. And the president's senior advisor on the environment was there, and we talked at some length. There was a guy from the Office of Budget and Management, OMB, Management and Budget, who was there, who came to me afterwards and said, until now I thought the sage-grouse was the name of a problem, and now I know it's more than that. Well, that meant a lot to me. He's the bean counter who's trying to figure out how much it's going to cost us to save this bird and where those dollars are going to come from. And so that meant a huge amount. Sometimes the small audience matters a lot. Granted, I'm actually talking to an empty room here, but I look really intent. But it was, when I got back, the head of the lab of ornithology asked me, he said, did they want to know what we thought about the species or the science? Did they come to us for our rich science, foundation? And I said, no, they wanted to know what people out west think of the pretty pictures of birds. They want to know how it goes down. What do people say about it? And how does the communication message go? I have to say the screening went really well. There weren't that many people there, but Barack came by afterwards, gave me a high five with my son on my shoulder. That's actually from a campaign rally, and that really is me shaking Barack Obama's hand. But he was busy at his birthday party. But we do know that his senior environment person was there, and that she understood that the message what we were delivering was important. We talked a lot about how using incredibly high quality imagery could really help drive things, that Fish and Wildlife tended to rely on very distant, dark, contrasty shots of the birds doing strange things. And that we really felt that the message that was put out there, as they conveyed whatever their decision was, that message should be done in a way that was respectful and highlighted the beauty and importance and the heritage nature of this in the American landscape. And so after this, we were quite happy to be approached by Interior to help them with the announcement video, which they actually announced, this first endangered species announcement done on social media, for which we produced this with the Secretary Jewel.
Today, I'm proud to mark a milestone for conservation in America. Because of an unprecedented effort by dozens of partners across 11 western states, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has determined that the Greater Sage-grouse does not require protection under the Endangered Species Act. Here's why that matters. The Greater Sage-grouse is an amazing bird, unique to the vast sagebrush landscapes of the American West. One that historically used to darken the skies as vast numbers took flight. The bird's mating displays are quite a spectacle, and they live in tough country where it's bone dry in summer and bitter cold in the winter. This landscape is also home to hundreds of species that define the West, from elk and mule deer to pronghorn and golden eagles. A healthy sagebrush landscape also supports a healthy Western economy for ranching, outdoor recreation, and energy that powers our nation. But this vast landscape is suffering death by 1,000 cuts. Longer, hotter fire seasons have eliminated millions of acres. Invasive species are pushing out native vegetation, and development is fragmenting the land. By many measures, the sage-grouse serves as the pulse of this imperiled ecosystem. Scientists estimate that greater sage-grouse populations have fallen by as much as 90% since the 19th century. The deteriorating health of the bird has sparked the largest land conservation effort in U.S. history. People from different backgrounds and livelihoods came together for a common goal: to protect the remarkable sagebrush landscape that defines the American West. Government at every level, ranchers, industry, firefighters, scientists, sportsmen and women, and conservation organizations came together to reduce threats to the bird and to conserve the sagebrush ecosystem. This has been an extraordinary effort on a scale we've never seen before. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has determined that these collective efforts add up to a bright future for the sage-grouse. This is not only good news for the greater sage-grouse, but for Westerners who want to honor their proud wildlife and outdoor heritage and pass it on to future generations. With climate change and an expanding population, the stresses on our land, water, and wildlife aren't going away. But I'm optimistic that we have shown that epic collaboration across a landscape, guided by sound science, is truly the future of American conservation.
Well, so there's the answer to the lingering question. Actually, so one of the questions that comes out is, do I agree with the Secretary of the Interior about this? She had a very optimistic message, and we actually signed on to help her deliver it regardless of what the answer was, because we couldn't know in advance unless we signed non-disclosures and agreed. So the truth of the matter is that they had to not list this bird. I don't agree that the future is bright for this bird. I think that's an overstatement, one I tried to get out of the script. But there's some massive effort to change the way in which we run the lands out there, and that is part of what has provoked some of the ire of ranchers. The oilmen are interesting because they've gone back and they've just pressed pause on a few things. The fall in oil prices have given them a moment when it's not profitable anyway. So they're just going to wait on projects. And they have a very long time scale to make that money. And they will come back around. And we've fought with them on a few specific places around where we were filming. But the biggest thing are the controversies still in ranching, and that's what's really in the news. This piece, we continue to give footage away as often as we can to outlets so that when they talk about the bird, they do it in a way that's beautiful, to continue that message that it actually does matter and it's actually interesting visually. So this is one from the NBC News a few days ago.
The federal government has spent hundreds of millions of your tax dollars to save this bird, the sage-grouse, on government land in 11 western states.
If the sage-grouse is in trouble, it means the broader ecosystem, this range area, is also in trouble.
Ranchers and others who use the land fear they may be in trouble too, that government restrictions to save the bird's habitat make it harder for them to make a living.
You're stopping grazers, you're stopping energy development, you're stopping all the spin-offs that go with that, the people who need jobs, the people who live in those areas.
1 million sage-grouse have dwindled to a few 100,000. The new federal budget prevents them from being listed as endangered, prompting more rules. Ranchers argue regulations already in the works will be just as restrictive.
You'll draw up to a 2-mile radius around it and say you can't do any kind of grazing within that area. You're driving them out of business.
Environmentalists say more is at stake.
350 species of birds and wildlife that depend on the future of the sagebrush steppe ecosystem, and that's a big part of what's at stake, not just for this one bird.
Local officials, ranchers, and conservationists say Washington should bow out and let them decide how the bird and business interests can coexist. Tracy Potts, NBC News.
This is not an issue that's going away. The regulations that have been put in place, it's actually a tremendous this article, as superficial as it is, does allude to some interesting things. The reality of what was put in place to protect the federal lands is actually pretty restrictive. We've radically increased the potential for real conservation to come out of the Bureau of Land Management. It's still a question whether or not it will. I mean, BLM is not known to be a conservation organization, but they have the potential to steward the Western lands better under the set of regulations that are now there. They also might not. But if they followed those rules that are written now, the new plans that came to pass over this to avoid this endangered species listing, there is really a chance that we'll have a lot more of this habitat in the future and these animals in the future. On the other hand, this isn't going away. The reality is that this bird will be back up. It's already in the legal battles are already going, as the reporter said. Some people think that the regulations that are in place are worse than an endangered species listing would have been, and they might be right for ranchers and for oilmen. And so they're going to fight the decisions. It's going back and forth, and it'll be in the news for the next few decades. As if the sage-grouse numbers decline, they'll apply in 5 years to list it, and we'll go through this whole thing again. And the challenge for us is to stay relevant in that. It's, a television show comes and goes, and so I think what we need to be asking ourselves is sort of, what's next? How do we stay, as environmentalists who want to help make the decisions that preserve this ecosystem, how do we stay part of that dialogue? So I left the Lab of Ornithology to start my own production company, partly so that I could continue on this particular ecosystem instead of moving on to the next one. And I'm working with a group from Audubon and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and out of Oregon and out of Colorado and Wyoming, to create educational materials for schools, a curriculum based around the sagebrush ecosystem. The idea being that kids out there don't necessarily learn about their own habitat, they learn about the rainforest. Well, the rainforest has more species, but this is a real opportunity for people to get outside and learn about nature and their own surroundings, which is really important. If they're in the cities, maybe to have a field trip or at least recognize the places that are in between where they're going and where they are as something interesting. And so we're working on curricular materials, videos that are specifically tailored to those materials, because when PBS makes educational materials, they take little excerpts, and like you might have seen here, excerpts only kind of work. So it's better for us to make self-contained things that use the same language as what's in the curriculum and address the lesson in the same way. So we're making those things now. We want to be in the schools, and the lesson on the school curricula is that they don't change often. So there's a lot of money coming in right now to try and get this thing out across the 11 states. If they can get a lot of adoption, it'll probably be there for a decade, for the next couple of cycles of endangered species discussion. And maybe, just maybe, we can grow a greater environmental ethic in the generation that will make the next decision. That's the goal, and it's lofty and difficult, and it might be unrealistic, but that's what we try and do. And then my next film, I'm hoping to go back and build on the golden eagle work. The golden eagles touch about every conservation problem there is for wildlife in the U.S., and it allows me to stay in the habitat and talk about what's happening to golden eagles. They have another set of legal protections. So I'm working on that film now as well. So the goal is to stay involved in the ecosystem and pick a battle that I can try and have an impact on, if only in a supporting role, to the scientists and the policymakers and the various others, to say, build that question of, build that sense that this actually isn't just an empty wasteland, but an actual valuable, important American ecosystem that we should and can care about and have an opportunity, as opposed to a lot of other ecosystems we've already trashed, to save. Because there is still a fair amount of it out there, and there is hope. Now, I have been told that as soon as I say thank you, everyone will get up. And so what we did is we put something in the pizza that if you get up right now, when I put this word up, you will explode. It worked.
Hi, my name is Natalie Salinardo, and I'm a sophomore here. I watch a lot of nature documentaries, specifically ones that deal with species conservation, and I agree that sometimes naming one source as like a cause of the decline can be a little heavy, but sometimes I think it's necessary for a call to action. I watched this documentary earlier this week, and I really enjoyed it. And maybe because I don't live near this ecosystem, I didn't feel a specific call to action, but I was wondering if there was anything that we could do here.
That's really great. Thank you so much. That means a lot. Yeah, we didn't want a specific call to action. We really wanted it to be a place for people to start learning, and also for the NGOs. We did a lot of social media with the NGOs to do their own calls to action. And so, for example, the American Bird Conservancy has a website where you can go and learn where we are right now and which congressmen to write right now. And they did a lot of social media outreach to get people to go and sign and get out there. That's one place to go, is to American Bird Conservancy. You can find out. The Write Your Congressman thing actually does play a real role in these things. I've now learned, now living in DC, they count those. Even the form letters, believe it or not, they count them. And the other thing is simply, like visit. Next time you drive across America, stop for a day with a pair of binoculars in the sagebrush. You'd be amazed how many people don't think there are any wildlife there worth being interested in. And they are cryptic and hard to see, but people who live there don't think anybody appreciates the place. And anytime anybody does, that's really a meaningful thing. But there are so few people there that, believe it or not, stopping in a few places, you can actually touch individuals that matter with your vote, that it's an interesting spot. Go to Jackson, and instead of just going skiing in Wyoming, go down to Pinedale and go visit the pristine areas around the range there, the Wyoming range, and also the areas that are torn up by the oil infrastructure. So when you're out west, spend a little time in the sagebrush. That would really help. And share the movie. That helps also.
Thank you.
Yeah, and here.
Hi, my name is Ken Davidson. I'm a senior environmental science major. In your talk, you mentioned that when you made the transition from UC San Diego to Cornell, that you went from the esoteric to the more practical. And I think a lot of us that come up through the academic system are taught to be academics and think about data and talk in jargon. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that transition from somebody who's coming from an academic setting, doing academic research for peer-reviewed journals, into somebody who's making films for the mass media and trying to convince people that might not have had that educational background, or not necessarily convince, but just educate them about these issues that are important. It's not in their backyard, they don't think about it. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, maybe if you had some challenges coming from that academic background into the mass media background, and provide us a little bit of information if we're inclined to make that transition ourselves.
Yeah, it's been really interesting for me, and I don't remember exactly when it happened, but my wife tells me when she met me, when I first got to Cornell, that I really wasn't an environmentalist at all. And I think she's right. I've had other people accuse me of exactly that. My work was so esoteric. I worked on the physics of the acoustics of this bird, and I was really fascinated by that. Actually, when they told me that I might be shut down at my research site, I was bothered. What do you mean there aren't enough birds? There's plenty of birds out here for me to study. You're still hunting them. I did the same thing everybody else does when they knee-jerk are told. And I think it's really just being, honestly, the Lab of Ornithology is a spectacular organization with passionate people working on conservation every day. And I just realized that, oh my God, I am now part of this. And then the first films that I made and worked on, one with one of your faculty members here, Ellie Rice, who helped with the educational materials for one on sound in the ocean, was still physics and acoustics, but it started to nudge in that sort of conservation direction. At some point, we started making conservation films, literally almost through filmmaking, that I found environmentalism. That's a little weird, but I think it's true. I got sent along the border wall, traveled it from San Diego to Brownsville, back and forth across the border wall, to look at the effects on wildlife. Not so much birds, who mostly can fly over, but other wildlife. And that made me feel sort of like a radical. I crossed the fence, I crawled under it, I crawled around it, and I felt, I think that's part of what became, exciting. And again, also filmmaking is exciting and intoxicating, and the more you feel like what you're doing matters, the more you want to do it. And research I wish I knew the answers to the questions I set out to answer. I wish there was a biologist out there who was going to tell me what the answers are to why they do what they do. There isn't. We don't get to know. Maybe some other generation, but for me, this is just more fulfilling, and I still get to be academic-y, right? I'm here. Thank you for asking. I hope that answers. Over there?
Hi, I'm a freshman here. My name is Amelia, and I'm actually from the West, and I grew up kind of on the outskirts of where a lot of these grouse are. And I know you mentioned that hunting isn't really as big of an issue now, but I remember seeing tons of hunters come in from where I was from with just tons of birds, because I know the bag limit is still relatively high.
Yeah.
Do you know if the Fish and Wildlife Department has lowered the bag limit as this has become more of an issue, or is it still upwards of like 25, because that's usually the seasonal limit?
Yeah, hunting is somewhat self-regulated by the fact that they're harder to find, and there are just fewer and fewer hunters out there trying. I mean, have you ever tasted one? They're not very good. But they have been a major staple. I don't know if people realize this, but the pioneers and Native Americans ate a lot more sage-grouse than they did buffalo. Sage-grouse, the sage chicken, was an important food for the pioneers. Also, the Lewis and Clark expedition ate a lot of them going across the West. So people have killed a lot of them before. The truth of the matter is the hunting community is a really important ally in the fight to save the public lands. And so the data don't suggest that that's a major factor in their decline, partly because I think bag limits have gone down, hunting pressure has gone down, less people are doing it. If you hunt the heck out of them, you do impact the sage-grouse, you definitely do. But the area I was at where somebody I know kills a grouse a day throughout the falconry season, it's actually one of the best areas that I've ever been in terms of thick from grouse. So I think it's important to keep the hunters engaged. I don't hunt. I don't like hunting. I didn't really like being served sage-grouse, but it is an important ally in the environmental issue. So keeping it going, as ridiculous as it seems, through an endangered species debate has probably helped keep some people at the table. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Trexler Hearn. I'm a sophomore here, and I'm from the western slope of Colorado, and actually 4 years ago got to work with the U.S. Forest Service doing a lot of data collection on sagebrush habitat for the Sage-Grouse project. And I loved the visual representation because it is such a different and beautiful environment. But one of our control transects was a 2-acre plot that was a 10-foot cattle fence around it for I think the past 75 years or so. And it was amazing, the dramatic increase in health of that environment versus just the regular plain on the outside of the fence. So like the cattle have a very large effect with the sagebrush habitat. And then in the NBC video, there was one of the representatives talking about the great restrictions on like ranching. I was wondering how great of restrictions they are, because he quoted a 2-mile circumference, which is about like 13 square miles, which is basically nothing, and how widespread of an environment that is. So.
Yeah, you're totally right. And cattle are, a third rail out in the West. It's genuinely dangerous to talk about restrictions on ranching, as we've learned in the news lately. And they've managed to get themselves, the cattle lobby has managed to get themselves somewhere ranked in like the 7th or 8th or 9th most important factor affecting sage-grouse, when they are probably, at least historically, the top. It's ranging, it's the open range that destroyed the habitat in the first place. Now the BLM allows, segregates it out, but the habitat's completely lost. I mean, the West doesn't look like what it used to look like. And even your plot doesn't have the same biota that it used to have a long time ago before the cattle ran on it. You can't quite put some of it back, bacterial colonies in the soil and such. But The reality is that the restrictions are better. There's a lot of incentives on private land. I mean, we're throwing a ton of money at this as a country. We're already subsidizing beef. Beef is not a particularly profitable industry. I don't know, what's the beefumentary or the whatever? There's a good show right now about the cattle, and I should be a vegetarian. Anyway, but the reality is that, that beef are a huge problem. They have a massive impact on the land. They aren't an industry that makes self-supporting capitalistic sense in the US at this point. What we've done is increase the subsidies to people for doing what they're continuing to do to maintain the history of ranching on the land, and we've asked them to graze a little lighter in response. That's on private lands, so the Sage-grouse initiative. On public lands, we've increased some of the protections for public lands, mostly seasonally, and that'll decrease the amount of cattle on the lands to some extent, but not a lot. You're totally right. People really picked on oil and gas because when oil and gas comes in, it's totally destructive. And wind energy, which is also totally destructive when it comes in. They picked on those. The restrictions to grazing managed to be sort of moderate. So we're not going to see major changes across the areas that are heavily grazed, unfortunately.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, over here.
Hi, my name is Fatu and I'm a senior here, and I'm interested in whether you see yourself more as a scientist or an artist, and how does one, I guess, persona over the other helps you do the impact that you hope to have in this world?
I definitely don't consider myself an artist, although I've sort of dealt with the idea that I'm a filmmaker because I make films, like on a literal level, I am a filmmaker. I will always, I think, be a scientist first. And that actually is an encumbrance because the script has a few narrative moments where it kind of says something and then doesn't, because I refuse to let it say the wrong thing. I've been told by some executives in television that I'm going to have to lighten up a little bit just to make the stories flow a little better. But I think I'll always be that scientist who's really focused on trying to get something meaningful in there and interesting into the public realm. And also partly it's because I'm, as a producer, I shot about 2.5 minutes of this film. I'm really proud of those 2.5 minutes, but I'm not really the guy behind the camera. I helped. I sat in the mixing room with the mix, but I didn't do the mix. I mean, I'm the producer. That's hardly an artistic role in many ways. So I won't claim artist. I think I'm actually getting close to time. So go ahead.
Okay. My name is Rachel. I'm a joint major in biology and environmental science, and I wanted to know specifically about the sage-grouse. What is it about it that makes it so important to the sagebrush ecosystem, and if there are other species either equally or more important in protecting in order to preserve that ecosystem? Like, is it a keystone species?
Well, it's an umbrella species. So there's a big difference between a keystone species and an umbrella species. The umbrella species is the way in which we can use legislation and other factors for management to save the land for all the species. If you took all the sage-grouse out of the sagebrush, what would happen to the sagebrush steppe? The reality is, I don't know. I don't think very much. The sagebrush is important, but it's actually not on its way out. There's plenty of bushes. That's part of the challenge, right? There's a lot of it out there. It's just not very healthy. I'm sure down the way some of these other endemics would be affected, but it's not really the ecosystem service. Isn't provided to the landscape. We need the sagebrush. The sagebrush holds the water in place, and the aquifers wouldn't be there if we eliminated and mowed out all the sagebrush. The sage-grouse is really, I can't say it provides much of an ecosystem service. It really is a piece of heritage, a natural heritage that we ought to care about for its own sake.
Thank you.
Maybe one more? Do I have time for one more? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Tom. I'm a sophomore government American studies major. When you look at the history of the American West, two large patterns tend to emerge in how legislation gets passed concerning nature. One of them is just kind of for the federal government to see stuff when no one's looking, such as with reclamation. and the second one is for large-scale cooperation between states and the federal government. Looking forward, how do you envision the most effective way to pass legislation or to get action done that effectively protects this area of the nation?
That's a really good question. I think the collaborative nature of this process has been epic, but it is because the Endangered Species Act is still around, and it was this huge, people say it's most important when it's not used. It's a threat, and it kept everybody at the table. And I think that is true in this case. A lot of people made deals they didn't like because of the potential of the Endangered Species Act. The reality is that in the end, the federal government had to tweak them just a little bit up, and that made everybody really angry. It is probably through this collaborative effort that we get people to buy in. On the other hand, the cynic in me says, where are we going to be in 100 years? Will we still have sage-grouse? Maybe not. Maybe not, because we didn't do more. But what we are doing is realistic, and it may get us to do more collaborative work in other ecosystems. You know, I'm kind of I'm a skeptic on that one as well, but I think that's what we push for. So I think collaboration with the states is likely to be better, because otherwise they'll take down the Endangered Species Act. Now, I wouldn't mind a full frontal assault on the Endangered Species Act, because most people actually like the act. And I think a move to remove it would not be welcomed by the general populace. Instead, we're doing it like 1,000 little cuts because we're afraid to use it. But still, it's an incredibly important piece of legislation. Probably the single most important thing we can do is preserve that act and use it wisely. Oh.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Let's thank Marc Dantzker one more time.
Thank you, guys.
We'll see you.